Well, welcome to Results 2020 coverage on clickorlando.com and News 6. I'm Lisa Bell. The polls closed just 2 hours ago in most of Florida, 1 hour ago in Northwest Florida, and we are starting to see some very early returns from here and other parts of the country. We're going to dive deeper into the turnout that we are seeing this election and what's driving people to the polls, what some of the big issues are this year, and what sort of legal battles we could face in the coming days. So I am joined now by several top legal minds and political experts. I want to briefly introduce each of you. Charlton Copeland is a professor at the University of Miami Law School, where he teaches constitutional law and, of course, several courses on the infamous Bush versus Gore case. Caroline Mala Corbin is also a professor at the University of Miami Law School, concentrating on the First Amendment and social justice. Dr. Larry Walker is an assistant professor of leadership at the University of Central Florida and spent 5 years working on Capitol Hill for Congressman Major Owens. Leroy Purnell is a professor and former dean of Florida A&M's College of Law and has taught courses related to civil rights, post-conviction relief, and racism in the law. And Eddie Dominguez, who chairs Latino Leadership, which is a grassroots organization in Central Florida. It helps the Latinx community make their voices heard and also works with several Fortune 500 companies. So we want to start off with the results in Florida. We have significant results coming in the presidential election. It looks like President Donald Trump will take Florida. He seems to, at this point right now, have a bigger lead than he had over Hillary Clinton back in 2016. And what's interesting about this is right now, really the reason why it seems that way is because of how Miami-Dade is voting. So Eddie, I almost want to start with you on this. What do you make of these results that you're seeing tonight in Florida?
Yeah, it's quite interesting. We've seen a lot more turnout, and that's fantastic. That bodes well. That makes me feel very optimistic. That it lends a lot more legitimacy to the results as well when you see the higher voter turnout. It's not surprising to see the way the counties went. The variation in the percentages aren't huge, but that differential in Miami-Dade County was huge. Biden really needed to take a higher percentage if he had any chance of taking the rest of the state.
Professor Corbin, you're in Miami. What do you make of the turnout in Miami-Dade County? Did you see any of these trends leading into Election Day?
It's hard to know. I did not actually have any particular expectations. I would have thought there would have been a greater split in Miami, and there wasn't.
Okay. Charlton, how about you? Were you anticipating this type of outcome or something different in Miami-Dade County?
As we got closer to Election Day, I'm less surprised. I did some poll work, so I was across the county over the last 2 weeks, and I got to see several early voting sites. The only place where I saw a significant line was in a largely Cuban early voting site out west in Hialeah. The lines were long consistently all day. This was Saturday. I was in, I think, 9 different early voting sites. No line was as consistently long as that line. And I'm talking about North Dade, Coral Gables, predominantly Black early voting sites. The site that I was in last Saturday was just a crowd all day long, and that was Halloween, right? And so it was really impressive.
Larry, you spent time on Capitol Hill. What do you make of that turnout?
So, I think that I always tell people, look at the candidates and the surrogates, where they go, right? So President Obama, they sent the big gun out this a few days ago. And I've been talking to my colleagues in various states, and particularly in the state of Florida and some on the Hill. And there was a lot of concern from the Biden campaign about Miami-Dade. I mean, you saw that play out today. Like I said, when President Obama came down here this week, yesterday or the day before yesterday, I knew that there was a problem. And like I said, obviously, Vice President Biden did well in the I-4 corridor, but there were concerns about Miami-Dade County, and unfortunately for him, great for the president. Because the panhandle certainly, is going to come through for him over the next, hour or so. But Miami-Dade County, in terms of the numbers, Vice President Biden just didn't work.
Leroy, you're obviously based in Central Florida. You talk about the I-4 corridor. It looks like both Pinellas and Seminole County will flip from red to blue in this election. Seminole County has not voted for a Democrat since Harry Truman in 1948. Had Miami-Dade County turned out for Joe Biden like it did for Hillary Clinton, this could be a very different story here in Florida tonight. What do you make of those shifting trends along the I-4 corridor?
I think that's very interesting. And certainly being in Central Florida, I had a somewhat of a stilted view. What we've seen in terms of results for Central Florida don't surprise me at all in terms of the strength of the Democratic vote. Look, I believe that Florida was always an uphill battle for Biden. And he needed to do well in Central Florida, and he did well. Again, Miami-Dade is the big question. And you know, as much as one may have hoped that it would somehow be a game changer, it's not that big a surprise. Now, what that means for the future for the state is another question. You know, I'm not sure that this breakdown will necessarily play out in other statewide elections.
So many people have said if Florida had gone blue this year, that the election would pretty much be very difficult for Donald Trump to win re-election. Now that it looks like Florida is going to go toward Donald Trump, that puts the spotlight even greater on many other battleground states, including Pennsylvania. There have been a lot of recent court rulings, including U.S. Supreme Court decisions affecting how and when ballots can be counted in some of those states. We know lawyers are lined up right now all across the country, waiting to respond if need be. So let's talk about some of those big decisions, especially in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, or North Carolina. I want to get to that first. Those states could potentially decide the election. The U.S. Supreme Court recently gave Democrats a win in both of those states. Republicans were challenging a decision by the Pennsylvania Supreme Court that extended the deadline for receiving absentee ballots by 3 days to November 6th in order for all of them to be counted. Previously, they were required to be received by 8 p.m. today. Meantime, in the North Carolina case, the court let stand some lower court rulings that allowed the state's Board of Elections to extend the deadline to 9 days after Election Day. That was up from 3 days called for by the state legislature. So we know that North Carolina and Pennsylvania will likely become now key in deciding the future of the presidency. However, in Wisconsin, the U.S. Supreme Court also recently gave the GOP a win because in that case, the extension came from a federal court, not a state court. So, you know, for the average person, why does that matter, Professor Corbin, where those decisions are coming from?
One thing I want to point out is I know you're describing these extensions of the deadlines as a win for Democrats, but I would like to point out that it's really a win for everybody who's voting by mail-in ballot. And I think it's important to recognize that all these challenges trying to restrict the vote are coming from the Republicans. But back to your question is how to explain these inconsistent decisions. Well, for the court, it matters who is making the decision about extending the law or not. And the Supreme Court feels that it's not appropriate for federal courts to step in and interfere with decisions made by the state because the Constitution delegates the power to the states. At least that's its reasoning. And so that's how you explain the difference in outcome between Wisconsin and Pennsylvania.
Okay, and Charlton, do you want to weigh in on that and the reasoning behind those some might see as being differing decisions in those cases?
I think I agree with everything Carolina said. I would add to that that it's not the federal court's role, or at least it doesn't see it as its role at this point, right? I think that when you read some of those decisions, some of the justices have intimated that post-election they are quite willing and will be ready to step in to think more about those issues. And so I think that things that we saw from Justice Kavanaugh, for example, last week, suggest that he's more than ready, and that he has some sense of the role that the court might play, right, a la Bush v. Gore, in any decision that I suspect he thinks is standardless, right? Meaning some decision to count ballots after tonight would, I suspect, have to meet with some set of standards that the court sees as legitimate.
So how does that comport with Bush versus Gore? Because in that case, the Supreme Court seemed to go against a state court decision.
In Bush v. Gore, the court in a 5-4 decision, right, essentially said that Florida's method of counting so-called undervotes, right, ballots that had not been counted, were, again, was standardless, right, and to the extent that it was standardless, risked a violation of the Equal Protection Clause if it were to go forward. It's not, this is 20 years on, right? I think the state of Florida has gotten better. My sense is most states have gotten better with respect to those sorts of standards. So it's not clear to me that we would be in the same position as we were 20 years ago.
And Leroy, I'll ask you, do you feel the Supreme Court is applying the law equally and fairly in all of these separate cases?
Well, I think the point's been made very well by Carolyn and Charlton that the role of the United States Supreme Court is not to run the elections for the state or to set state standards. This is part of the problem of Bush v. Gore. I mean, it's kind of dancing on a very thin line, not so much on the question of whether or not Florida at that time was standardless, but the timing of the court's decision in Bush v. Gore to step in is part of what inspires Justice Kavanaugh to now say, okay, we did that time, maybe we should be ready to do that again at some point. Although, again, the particular rationale, I think Professor Copeland's already dictated that specific issue is probably not going to be on the table right now. But I think that the key here for both Pennsylvania and the North Carolina decisions in particular is that these are not ballots that are coming in late. These are ballots that were postmarked by today. It's just that by the time they reach, in light of everything that's happening and has happened by disease and human design with the postal system, they're just now at the point of being counted. There's nothing that is particularly strange, I think, about recognizing the reality of when you get a chance to count the votes that have been postmarked by the date set for election. After all, a lot of people and presidents has tried to make a lot on this point. A lot of people think the election is decided today. The election is not decided today. The election is decided when the Electoral College votes, and even then, once Congress has accepted the vote of the Electoral College. We have about another almost 2 months before that whole situation plays itself out. So I think that the court is correct to allow postmarked election day postmarked ballots to be considered. I don't think it's surprising in that regard from the court. Does that tell us how what they'll do in other cases and when they'll do it? I'm not as certain there.
Larry, we know candidates on both sides of the aisle here have teams of lawyers lined up waiting to litigate these issues. Do you feel, though, as kind of a political operative, that states and lawmakers have done a better job of implementing or drafting or legislating standards to avoid some of these legal battles that could arise in these close elections?
So I have to, I'm from the great Commonwealth of Pennsylvania originally. So I think it's important to highlight that the reason why we might have some delay with Pennsylvania was done on purpose, right? So many states throughout the country begin to count those ballots earlier than Pennsylvania does, but Pennsylvania purposely decided, the legislature decided not to start counting those ballots as early as they needed to be. And I think that was purposefully done to kind of create this idea that goes along with some of the rhetoric we hear that there's something going on in Pennsylvania. So yes, I think that obviously it would have been nice for the governor and the Republican legislators to get together and reach some kind of consensus to ensure that there's not the kind of uncertainty that we may encounter this evening relating to Pennsylvania. Once again, people asserting that things are delayed and something's going on, where it was just a disagreement between the governor and the Republican legislators.
Since we're talking about the Supreme Court, let's talk about the death of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg and the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett that may have played a role in some of the turnout today. Eddie, do you think that the Supreme Court and what has recently happened is a big concern, especially among Latino and Hispanic voters?
Absolutely. There's no doubt about it. You see what happened with the decisions that quickly escalated after the passing of Justice Ginsburg, and you get to wonder, the electorate wants to respond quickly as well. They want to have their vote counted. They realize the power that the president holds to fill those vacant seats. And because they're lifelong appointments, you're setting the record for many, many years to come. But what the electorate sometimes realizes as well is, hey, the Supreme Court makes very narrow decisions, and many times they don't want to break with precedents. Pennsylvania case is a great example, right? It was actually a no decision. It was split 4-4. But now with Justice Barrett, she recused herself because she didn't have time to prepare enough of these cases. But all it meant was that they would continue to receive those ballots. Now, after the fact, there's no reason why another ruling could be brought before the court that asks, well, that's okay that they received those ballots, but will they be counted? Justice Barrett taking that position now, being able to vote on the Supreme Court, that decision could go up very differently.
Caroline, do you have any insight on how a Justice Barrett might rule in some of these potential election legal battles that we could be seeing really in the next few days?
She hasn't really, I don't think we have much of a track record on her views on election voting, though she is firmly in the conservative camp. So I can't imagine her breaking with the more conservative justices in their votes. Also, there's a lot of really important issues before the court that are coming up. So going back to your original question, will it have motivated voters? I think it most definitely did concerns about the courts, and not just the Supreme Court, but the other federal courts as well. The Supreme Court is a final interpreter of what the Constitution means. And this power to decide what the Constitution means really gives it immense ability to decide really controversial issues. And so tomorrow, the Supreme Court is going to hear a case where they're going to decide whether the Constitution gives religious organizations a right to discriminate against the LGBT members. And then the week after, they're going to hear a case about whether the Affordable Care Act is constitutional. And in the pipeline, the court may be making decisions about whether abortion is still protected by the Constitution and whether same-sex marriage is protected by the Constitution. So I think people have become increasingly aware of how important the Supreme Court is in deciding these very important issues that directly affect people in their everyday lives. So I think that definitely motivates people to get to the polls.
And Charlton, to bring you in on that discussion, we mentioned healthcare and Roe v. Wade. In some of the exit polls, people did mention healthcare especially being an important concern for them, especially amid this pandemic. What is interesting, though, it does look like when we are seeing some of the national numbers that Joe Biden is doing better than Hillary Clinton was. But here in Florida, I mean, that's still, those numbers are kind of flip-flopped. He's still doing much better here. What do you think it is about Florida voters? Was it that makes that different than other parts of the country?
So I think that Florida voters, particularly, and I want to focus on particular aspects of the Hispanic community in Florida, right? That is, it is at least in South Florida, the issue I think on lots of people's minds was about Venezuela and about the Trump administration's posture toward those sorts of issues. And so there's a certain kind of salience, I think, in South Florida to those issues that might benefit Donald Trump that don't benefit him with other Hispanic communities in other places across the United States. And so in that respect, I think I go back to Dean Purnell's earlier point, that is to say, I don't know how long lasting this marriage will be. That is, if Maduro leaves power under, for example, a Biden administration, right, the salience of this conflict becomes a bit less intense. And so, but to add on, I think to come back to the Supreme Court briefly, I want to sort of add on to something Caroline says. There are no vacancies, as I last looked, on the courts of appeals. Those are the appellate courts right beneath the Supreme Court. This president and the Republican majority in the Senate have done an incredible job of filling federal judicial vacancies. They are leaving the cupboard absolutely full, which is to say, if Donald Trump loses tonight, in some sense, less is lost than had he not gotten Amy Coney Barrett confirmed, right? That is to say, you've now solidified a 6-3 conservative majority on the court. You have a closet full of appellate court judges. And so we may actually think that some people who had misgivings about the president's assertions of power might feel more easy about breaking ranks with him at this point, because now they have the security of, I think, a very conservative federal judiciary, so that even a President Biden and the Democratic Congress seem less scary when you've got the judiciary to respond to their actions.
You mentioned there are no vacancies on the Court of Appeals. That leads me into my next question. And one of the questions in this election was, if elected, will Joe Biden pack the court? What does that mean? And what could that potentially look like? Larry, I want to bring you into that. So explain to our viewers what packing the courts actually means.
So I know you described me as a pundit earlier, but it's just punditry. I mean, my colleague talked about the exceptional job the Republicans have done with over 200 federal judges, I believe, over the last 4 years, multiple Supreme Court seats. So I want to highlight something that Vice President Biden said, I believe, yesterday or today. There's been a lot of conversation about, if he became president, what would he do about, the Supreme Court, federal seat, and, adding, federal judges. And he talked about, putting together this bipartisan committee. But I think he gave it away today or yesterday when he kind of reversed course a bit. He didn't say he wouldn't still do the committee, but he kind of essentially said he was opposed to what people were describing as packing the courts. So for those, some of those Democrats and, who are supporting him, they may certainly be disappointed. And obviously, my colleague talked about what a phenomenal job the Republican Senate did over the last couple of years in pushing through. What I might add, a lot of federal judges, but not many of color. And I believe none were Black, of those more than 200 that were appointed by the Senate. So when we talk about the lifetime appointment and the impact it have on an increasingly diverse society, there's a mismatch in terms of the courts. And then obviously there's a shift in the presidency in terms of the demographic that put Vice President Biden, then President Biden, into the White House.
How damaging is a trend like that, Leroy, when you hear that, none of the judges, were minorities that have, since been appointed and approved to the courts?
I think it's a cause of great concern. And this builds on the challenge that even President Obama had in trying to fill vacancies with a Senate that held up appointments. So there was this whole bunch of vacant seats that were just ready for the Republicans and for Trump to fill, and to change the perspective of it being a fair and open, quite frankly, appointment process, to have representative people of color and on the court. So in so many ways, the appointments of persons of color to the bench at the so-called lower court level, in my mind, in some ways, is even more important than the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court is pretty important. But the Supreme Court gets a lot of national scrutiny, whereas the day-to-day impact that federal judges at the district court level have on individual lives doesn't receive as much scrutiny, but certainly can be a lot more impactful when it comes to issues such as sentencing in the criminal system or fairness in civil litigation. People should be greatly concerned. If there's any good news about this election cycle and the attention paid to the court, is perhaps people are beginning to understand more the significance of legislative elections in particular, and their role in court appointments. We can hope. But I think that comments been made, and a very good one, that in many ways the philosophy of pushing the court to the right and diversifying the court has already been successful. I think there's another point here, though, that I'm just very curious about, and it has to do with the Barrett appointment, and that is the impact of the Barrett appointment on the makeup and direction of the current existing Supreme Court justices. Before the conservative Republicans take too much of a victory dance on this, there is certainly a real possibility that for some members of the court, this may result in some shifting of their votes. We've seen a little bit of that already. And certainly we've seen it in the past where as the court has a, quote, greater conservative makeup, some justices begin to shift more towards the middle. We may see that. We've seen a little bit out of Roberts, which was kind of on some issues. It's a spotty thing, and it's not, it's certainly not even across the board. But one thing I think we have to bear in mind, I think this is certainly true of the Roberts court. The court doesn't like to be used. It doesn't want to be seen as a tool of the executive branch, and certainly I think that's one of Roberts' concerns. What that will give him the I won't say courage, but certainly inspire him to do, it'll be interesting to see. Certain justices are going to, and certainly the more recent appointments are going to be very much toe the line. But I think some of the other justices may begin to say, wait a minute, before we shift this court too far to the right, on some issues, maybe we need to take a more moderate view. I'm just curious to see if that happens.
Caroline, let's talk about the Constitution and potentially reforming the courts. So how would that process be reformed? Because it is ultimately right up to the Senate to confirm a presidential appointee. And if you have Mitch McConnell, for example, who wants to block all of Barack Obama's appointees, it seems like he has the constitutional right to do that.
Going back to your original question about court packing, there's an argument to be made that the Senate has already used its constitutional power to pack the court, and in its own image. When Scalia died in the last year of Obama's presidency, he held up replacing that seat on the grounds that there was an election coming up, and therefore the people should decide on the next president, and that president should appoint someone. And yet in this election, as people were, when Justice Ginsburg died, that rule no longer seemed to hold. And even as people were voting, the Senate installed a sixth conservative on the court, making it a conservative court for decades. And so the idea of court packing, the original idea, is to increase the number of justices on the court and then put your own justices in. So it originally arose during Federal Delano Roosevelt's era, when he was trying to pass all this New Deal legislation, and the Supreme Court at the time kept striking it down, and he proposed expanding the court so he can install his own picks. That kind of maneuver would actually be perfectly constitutional, because the Constitution does not specify the number of justices on the court. And so it would be constitutional to expand the number of justices on the Supreme Court, although, as you point out, whether or not that's politically feasible depends on who controls the Senate, because the way that it works is that the president nominates someone and then the Senate has to confirm them. So whether politically or strategically it's a wise idea, it's constitutional, but it will depend on the outcome of the Senate races.
All right. And Eddie, I want to talk briefly about some of the turnout nationally. What do you see in terms of the Hispanic Latino vote nationally? Obviously, in Florida, we saw the trends in Miami-Dade County, especially that lean toward President Trump. What are you seeing, though, nationally?
Nationwide, we're seeing that Hispanics are making there are higher percentages of representation in the electorate, and that number is going to keep growing, especially after we get a better handle on the demographics from the 2020 census. Hispanics in general are coming out to vote more. They realize that they have now a sway, a power, a control. You can see that in how campaigns are run now, how they have specialists targeting that demographic more actively in communities. You also see the fact that the way media ads are played out and how they're doing very specific targeting towards Hispanics. As Hispanics become a larger percentage of the population, it's going to make a large difference in national elections and state elections and local elections as well. I hope that, speaking about seeing diversification in the courts, for example, I hope that to see that same diversification in political candidates as well. It would be wonderful to see that Hispanics are well represented across the board in all the positions possible.
All right, and we do have one more person joining us now. Fergus Bell is standing by. Thank you, Fergus, for joining us. I don't know if you can hear us right now.
Yes,
okay, so
I can. Good evening.
Very good. Fergus Bell is a journalist and the founder and CEO of Fathom, a news lab and consultancy that supports journalists and newsrooms around the world. He has worked on countering election misinformation in the UK, Mexico, India, Indonesia, and also during the last presidential election in 2016. He's previously worked for the Associated Press, where he established their verification processes and best practice for social media. I know you work a lot with our sister stations as well as us here at News 6 and clickorlando.com. So real quickly, I just want to bring you into this discussion. We've been talking a lot about the courts and how the courts could potentially play a role in the 2020 election. But first, have you seen today or the days leading up today any kind of unusual things happening with the election?
In the days leading up to today over the campaign, absolutely. Today, we've thankfully not seen as much as we feared. It's actually been what looks like a relatively calm election day in terms of misinformation. There have been some focused efforts or initiatives, mainly in Pennsylvania. There have been robocalls, so more of a kind of manual, analog form of disinformation happening in Michigan, New York, Maryland, Nebraska, Iowa. Not anything in Florida that I've been finding at the moment. Mm-hmm. But it's been a relatively calm day on the misinformation front, thankfully.
Are those efforts effective? The robocalls and the other efforts?
The robocalls and text messages are really interesting because we just don't know. And maybe that's indicative of something new. Social media, we can now get data from, we can monitor. We can't monitor private phone calls, private text messages, unless they get sent in or unless they find their way onto an open digital platform. So we don't know, and we won't know that until the researchers start to analyze it in the coming weeks and months.
And any idea where some of this misinformation, some of these robocalls are coming from?
at the moment, it's really difficult to attribute them. I wouldn't even want to guess. Again, it's going to be research long after the event that we're going to be able to determine that.
Comparing what you are seeing in this election to 2016, what are the differences? What are the similarities?
26. The difference now is that a lot of the techniques for spreading misinformation or jumping on to minor events and amplifying them to make them seem bigger, they're being used by the campaigns now. They're techniques that people know work because they worked in 2016 and they were being used by bad actors outside, foreign actors. Now they're used by campaigns because they're effective, and it just creates even more chaos and noise because of that. So yeah, 2020, more noise over the whole campaign, and legitimate campaigns learning from tactics that were previously seen to not be so legitimate.
Are social media companies doing enough to combat this? We've heard, Facebook and Twitter claiming that they're cracking down on this and trying to reduce some of this.
Twitter have been really active today. So there have been some incidents around certain hashtags, particularly again in Pennsylvania, and Twitter has proactively started labeling those tweets as disputed or misleading. So, and I don't think we've seen such a real-time reaction by the platforms before, but overall, of course, they could do more, of course. It's the tip of the iceberg, and there is so deep that they could go into fixing the bigger problems that exist on the platforms.
Larry, do you think there's any sort of will on Capitol Hill to address this issue?
So, you talked about Twitter and Facebook. The House and Senate have had several hearings, full committee and subcommittee hearings, meeting with the CEOs of the companies. And, obviously just, certainly Twitter, I guess more recently, has taken a stronger stand. And I know that some Democrats in particular have raised a number of concerns about what Facebook has and really hasn't done. So I think it really is going to be interesting if we get a Biden administration in terms of if Facebook takes even more steps to address some of the issues related to misinformation. I know that historically, the Republicans have been very good at criticizing Facebook, but they pretty much have not checked, various Republican affiliated organizations, including, the current president, and compared to what Twitter has done. And Twitter has been far more efficient in terms of addressing issues related to misinformation. But I think if we get in a Biden administration, that I think that when they get called to Capitol Hill, I think that there are going to definitely be some changes.
Charlton, if this ends up in a court battle regarding Pennsylvania, say, for example, and there is this campaign, this misinformation campaign, potentially coming from a lot of the president's supporters, perhaps even, how do you combat that? And how does that play into any sort of potential court battle and the outcome of that court battle?
I think that we saw this in Justice Kavanaugh's sort of statements that seem to parrot some of the misinformation and some of the sort of theories of the illegitimacy of late counted ballots, right? And so I think that there's a real worry that justices have already cast the die, as it were, with respect to how these disputes are going to be framed, right? And the way in which it was framed was, well, we've got to protect the legitimacy of the process, as though counting ballots that were cast prior to an election were somehow per se questionable, and that the court had a role in protecting our democracy from even the appearance of a certain kind of illegitimacy, right? And so, so on the one hand, you get an expansion of the role of the court, and you get a kind of legitimacy of the narratives that I think have been articulated in the political media and by campaigns that really disturbs some court watchers.
Yeah, and Leroy, you talked about the Supreme Court being used as a political tool. Obviously, that's a concern for a lot of people right now, but historically speaking, has that always been a concern?
Well, I mean, there's always been the concern. I think there has been a general sense among the court to not allow itself to be used as much in the past. Not that it hasn't happened. There's certainly occasions where it's happened, but the courts have tended to be very wary of that. I think the concern now, and this builds on the last question, one of the concerns right now is what happens in this interim period between the today and the time of really a time of inauguration. We've got a safe harbor, what's known as a safe harbor date, which I believe this year is December 8th, where the states must resolve any disputes about the election for purposes of the Electoral College conducting its vote. And one of the areas of concern in that area is that typically, my former colleague at Ohio State, Ned Foley, has done some great work on this. Typically, you have canvassing of late ballots and late precinct reporting. That's normal. That happens every election. And the thing that's interesting about that sort of canvassing of close elections is that just what Ned's work showed, it tends to shift towards the Democrats. Now, getting to the question that you've asked and what Mr. Bell is talking about as well, the real danger right now, one of the real dangers right now is by using false information to somehow make like this is some plan of fill in the blank in terms of your left-wing fear, some plan of people to undo the election and to undermine the confidence of the election system, which then presumably would allow for court intervention at the Supreme Court level if somehow we couldn't trust these results or couldn't trust this effort to do recounts and resolve issues before the safe harbor date. And so we've seen already the sort of claims of claims of voter fraud, mail fraud that have absolutely no evidence behind them. And much of that is aimed at issues such as, and we talked a little bit about Pennsylvania and some other states, where you have late precincts that will be, the results will be reviewed and there will be a shift towards Democrats on that. And so, if the court, I am concerned if the court is prepared to look past false claims and false monsters and to undo a process that has existed in this country for a long, long time that allows for these issues to be resolved before the Electoral College gets to vote. I'm very concerned about that.
Eddie, I want to go back to the election. Did you see, major misinformation campaigns targeting the Hispanic community this year? And if so, how did they differ from anything you might have seen 4 years ago?
You hear a lot of comments that come out in the political rallies about which way the Hispanic vote should go. And it's less misinformation and more guilt tripping, I would say. You get false promises about what has happened in the past and how that is a demarcator for what's going to happen in the future and what protections the Hispanic community is going to get. Because there's some real deep issues at stake for the Hispanic community, everything from immigration law to all sorts of reforms in how college debt is handled, how the future of the young Hispanic population in the U.S., what that future looks like for them when you consider things like the Dreamers Act or the Affordable Care Act. All of these issues are at stake, and I think there's mismessaging that comes out during the political rallies, during the media campaigns, especially those campaigns that are not so much driven by the political parties, but by outside, conglomerates that are pushing a certain message for Hispanic voters. Obviously, it's going to be a very large block, the Hispanic community, and how it will sway future votes is going to be tremendously important. But you have to wonder about those false promises and what are they really voting for or against. And I fear that there is no clear messaging. It becomes very difficult during these political times to get grasp at does this candidate really mean for my future as a Hispanic, and that's very dangerous in our democracy.
Caroline, the president has said that he believes the Supreme Court will intervene in the upcoming election to hand him a second term. What happens if Biden is the clear winner and the president refuses to leave?
The very fact that you have to ask this question about the president of the United States shows how little respect Trump has for the rule of law and is very distressing. I think it also really shows how far the United States has fallen on the world stage. We used to be a shining example of democracy, and now we're worried about a peaceful transition of power. Most likely there will be, it depends how big the margin of victory it is. And regardless, probably Trump will bring a slew of lawsuits. And if they are without merit, he will lose them. Will the Supreme Court, so that even if the Supreme Court were to rule in his favor, if the margin is large enough, it won't matter. I just think that I can't predict what the question is, how will the Supreme Court rule? It's really hard to answer that question without knowing specifics of the case before them, because ultimately they're still going to make decisions based on law. And while they can stretch and strain it to some degree, there are limits to what they can do. So it's hard to say definitively what role they may play. But I think the bottom line is that Trump does not decide the election. The Supreme Court does not work for Trump. And we have to hope that the institutions that we have to sort of deal with.
And Charlton, I want to mention one thing too. 2 years ago, Floridians changed the Constitution to allow returning citizens the ability to vote. A lot of Democrats were hoping that a lot of these ex-felons would turn up at the polls today and maybe swing Florida blue. Does not look like that happened today, but how important was that effort in this election and moving forward?
I think that effort is hugely important. Again, in the polls, the early voting sites in which I sat, there were returning citizens who voted for the first time, and some of them men of senior age, and I think that's important, because I think that it reconnects people to the project of democracy. I think it reconnects people to a certain kind of civic status, which is important. I think that we studies have shown how interaction with the carceral state reduces a whole host of not just a person who's been convicted of a felony, his or her engagements, but have an effect on the communities from which they come. And so I think that there's a larger sense of the ways in which communities might be reconnected to the political process through this. I think that there's an increased engagement and an increased awareness, not simply about the amendment process and that amendment particularly, but about what happened after that. That is the decision with respect to fines and fees and the policy decisions that were made, even as unfortunate as those decisions are, from my opinion, I think that they are educational lessons in the policymaking process. And so I think that even though it hasn't panned out in the ways that some might have thought, I think that it's important, and it's an historic effort that we ought to be proud of in the state of Florida.
And now one hypothetical, and I'll start with you, Larry. What if this election ends up in an electoral college tie?
Oh, please. So I think we talked earlier. I was working on the Hill during Bush v. Gore. I really would hope that doesn't happen. I can tell you Capitol Hill was just a maddening place to work at that time. But I'm hoping, as someone who believes in democracy, that this election will be settled without the courts getting involved. And if the courts get involved, and I'm quite sure there are going to be some losses. I mean, I think the president has been clear about telegraphing what he plans to do. But hopefully there is we've got a clear idea who will win one way or the other, at least, and obviously certainly not tonight, to avoid the courts getting involved. Because if the courts get involved, then I think that there are going to be some serious challenges for this country as it relates to ensuring that we continue to be a democracy. Because I think one thing that's important is that a democracy is something you have to nurture. And that when we talk about this transition of power, in functional democracies, you don't have to have these kind of concerns. And I know my colleague was trying to make that point clearly earlier. But I'm hoping as a citizen and someone who believes in democracy, that does not happen. Because if it does, it will be a nasty fight, and it will certainly hamper efforts for this country to continue to be a thriving democracy.
Leroy, your thoughts on that?
Yes, I mean, I agree wholeheartedly with what Professor Walker and Professor Corbin has said. And in many ways, that's an even bigger issue and a more serious question than who wins this election. I mean, this is the big deal, obviously, who wins the election. But it's even a bigger deal if our whole basis of government is undermined and discredited. And so I have a lot of concern. The question that you'd asked earlier about, so what happens if if Biden's a clear winner, and sort of my response to that, and it fits in with your question now, is that, well, that presupposes that we determine a clear winner based on tonight's results, or even electoral college. But it doesn't take account for the fact that Trump may deny that there are clear winners. I mean, his strategy, the legal strategy at this point, I think on his part, should Biden be ahead, is to destroy trust in the electoral system and to try to convince everybody to know there is not a clear winner, and therefore the electoral college cannot do its job. And one of the things that's built into the law at this point, both in terms of statute and constitution, is if for some reason electoral college cannot do its job, at some point this gets thrown into the legislature, and so that is a nightmare, as Professor Walker said. But it's even. It's something I could never imagine would have happened in this country, and that hopefully will never happen. But it really is ultimately very destructive to our sense of how a republic should work.
Caroline?
And that's going to be a big problem.
Mm-hmm. Caroline?
No, I again, there is a process. If the question is if there's a tie. There is a process, but it could get very messy. And I think there has already been such an attack on the integrity of our electoral system in multiple ways. I mean, I think so much of the pushback against all the expansion of voter accessibility was based on this idea that there was a rampant problem of voter fraud. And there just isn't. I mean, study after study has shown that people don't cheat when it comes to voting. I mean, there was one study that said there were, out of 1 billion votes over so many years, there were only 32 instances of someone impersonating somebody else and guilty of voter fraud. And so we have that attack on our electoral integrity. And then we have the latest myth that that the issue will be decided tonight. No, it's only part one tonight. Tonight we finish voting, and part two is the counting. And it's always been like this. And to argue that counting votes is somehow illegitimate is yet another attack on the integrity of our electoral system. And I think it's so distressing to have these repeated attacks on the very heart of what makes us a democracy. And I really don't know how much more we as a country can take.
Eddie?
One of the things that I always wonder when you play out a scenario like that is pretext. You know, why did people do certain things, and was there an underhanded reason for doing that? When you notice that the last three justices that have been put on the Supreme Court were attorneys who successfully prosecuted during the Gore v. Bush case, you have to wonder, well, what are we preparing for here, right? But to be fair, both parties have literally hired armies of lawyers, and they're all gaming these scenarios behind closed doors. What can happen? And we need to prepare to make sure that we have a countersuit or a counteraction. Now, to me personally, that's depressing in our political environment, that it comes down to that. Because even if we are split politically as a country, you see this progressive pushback, and it's very evident here in Central Florida more than anywhere else, where you have a higher and higher percentage of the electorate becoming independent voters because they don't want to be affiliated with that level of distrust and underhandedness. It's demoralizing, quite honestly, that it would have to be pushed to that extreme where you need to have a court step in and moderate.
Fergus, could you imagine the misinformation that could take place if we ended in a electoral college tie?
I don't know if I want to imagine. I think some of the groundwork has been sown. Talking earlier about Pennsylvania, which looks like it could be a tactic for a long game. You know, just starting to sow doubt in the process. And it's again important to say that these incidents, they were such a small number of incidents, but they get a lot of attention, and that just sticks in people's minds. And I think that's what's dangerous, because you go into any decision or into any legal battle, and you've got people thinking, you know, of course I saw this and this and this. Actually, it was one tiny incident, and a lot of them were resolved very quickly. So yes, this is just a small preview of what might come if things get nasty in court.
And Charlton, you can have the final say.
So much of what I think happens depends on what losers say, right? And if we think back to 2008 and we think about the late John McCain and what he said on the night he lost the presidency, he said that Barack Obama was his president. And I think that he said that to his constituents, and they were not altogether accepting of that. And that's important. And so whatever the outcome of tonight, I think it's important, not just that we understand what the formal processes are, but there are informal processes and there are norms. And I think what we have learned over the last 4 years, if nothing else, what it means to lose commitment to norms of building confidence in our processes and our institutions. What happens when that faith and that trust is lost? I think the cost is higher than we had imagined. And so I think that so much of this is up to whomever loses, whether that's tonight or whether that's sometime after tonight. I think he will have to speak to his constituents to say that we have one president and he is our president. And again, to go back to Caroline's statement, it's disappointing that we don't know whether that will be set.
All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining us tonight and providing all of our viewers such great insight. We appreciate the time that you spent with us and all of that valuable information. And maybe we'll be seeing you again soon in the coming days. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.